My older brother betrayed me with my girlfriend in my own bed. Years later, my father died and left him only $500 in his will. But when he came back begging for money, my answer destroyed him, and he never saw coming what I did next. I'm 31 years old, work in real estate, and I need to get this story off my chest because what happened like 14 years ago basically destroyed my family and left me without a brother. People always ask me if I have siblings, and I just say no, because technically I do have one, but to me, he stopped existing a long time ago. And I know that sounds harsh, but when you hear what he did, you're going to understand why. I guess I should start from the beginning, when we were kids and everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as our situation could be. My mom died when I was about 5 years old, breast cancer, and my dad Mark raised me and my older brother Austin by himself. Dad never remarried, never even had a serious girlfriend that I remember, like he was completely dedicated to raising us and his job as a supervisor at a factory. Austin was 8 years older than me, so when I was in elementary school, he was already in high school. And then when I got to high school, he was already working and living at home while saving money. We weren't rich at all. We lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, but Dad always made sure we had what we needed, decent clothes, food on the table, that kind of thing. What I remember most about my dad is that he was super strict about loyalty and respect. He always told us that family was the most important thing, that we could lose money, lose jobs, whatever, but we should never betray family. It was almost like his life philosophy, I guess, and I admired him so much for that because he was a guy who really lived by his values. Austin and I grew up hearing those lessons all the time. Like every time something happened in the news or with someone we knew, Dad would use it as an example to teach us about the importance of loyalty and honesty. When I was 17, I was in my senior year of high school. I was a pretty normal kid, honestly. Played on the track team, had decent grades. Nothing extraordinary, but it wasn't a disaster either. I had started dating Nicole about 6 months before. She was my age, went to the same school, and honestly, I thought it was serious. You know how it is at that age when you think your first girlfriend is going to be forever? Nicole came to my house often, knew my family, got along well with my dad, and Austin had met her a couple of times when we coincided at home. Everything changed on a Tuesday in March. I think, or maybe it was April. I'm not completely sure, but I know it was spring because I remember the weather was nice. That day, I had left track practice early because the coach had canceled practice, something about a teacher's meeting or I don't know what. The point is, I got home around 4 in the afternoon, when I normally got there, around 6. I opened the front door, and the house was silent, which wasn't unusual because Dad didn't get home from work until 6:30 or so, and Austin was supposedly working his shift at the warehouse, where he had a part-time job. I went upstairs to go to my room, and when I got to the second floor, I heard weird noises coming from my bedroom, like murmurs and movement. And my first thought, honestly, was that maybe someone had broken in to rob us or something. I approached the door and threw it open, without knocking or anything because I was scared and confused. And there they were, Austin and Nicole, in my bed. And when I say they were there, I don't mean they were sitting talking. You know what I mean? I don't know how long I stood there in the doorway. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Nicole screamed and tried to cover herself with the sheets, and Austin just sat there with this look of absolute panic, and I just couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain literally refused to accept that my older brother, the guy who was supposed to look after me and set an example, was sleeping with my girlfriend in my own bed. I didn't scream or anything dramatic, which, to this, the day surprises me because normally I'm pretty explosive when I get angry, but at that moment I just felt like I was underwater. Everything sounded muffled and distant. The only thing I said was something like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And Austin started trying to explain, saying he was so sorry, that he didn't know how it had happened. All that typical garbage people say when they're caught doing something unforgivable. Nicole was also crying and trying to talk, but I couldn't even look at her. I just told her to get dressed and get out of my house, and then I left the room and went downstairs. I sat on the living room couch shaking, not from cold but from pure adrenaline and shock, and waited for them to leave. I heard them coming down the stairs about 10 minutes later. Austin tried to approach me, but I told him to stay away, and Nicole ran out the front door crying. Austin stood there in the middle of the living room telling me we needed to talk, that it wasn't what it looked like, all that stupid stuff, and I just told him to shut up and wait for Dad to get home because, I wasn't going to be the only one dealing with this. Dad got home at his normal time, around 6:30, and when he walked into the house and saw Austin and me sitting on the couch not talking, with the faces we had, he immediately knew something bad had happened. He took off his work boots, sat in his favorite chair, and said, "Okay, what happened?" I looked at Austin, expecting him to have the guts to confess, but he just sat there silent, looking at the floor. So I ended up telling him. I told him exactly what I had seen. No embellishments or exaggerations, just the facts. My dad's face when I told him is something I'll never forget. He didn't yell or turn red with anger like I expected. Instead, he went pale and looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He sat there in silence for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, and then he looked at Austin and asked him if I was true. Austin nodded his head without looking up, and Dad just said, "Get up and pack your things. You have 1 hour to get out of my house." Austin finally looked up and started begging, saying he was sorry, that it had been a mistake, that he had nowhere to go. But Dad just repeated, "You have 1 hour," and wasn't even looking at him when he said it. I had never seen my dad like that, like completely cold and shut down, and it was scary, honestly. Austin looked at me like expecting me to say something or intercede for him, but I just looked away because there was nothing to say. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Austin went upstairs, and we heard him moving around his room, packing things, and Dad and I sat in the living room without talking. About 45 minutes later, Austin came down with 2 large suitcases and a backpack, stood at the entrance to the living room, and said again that he was sorry, that this wasn't going to end like this, that we were family, and Dad just responded, "Not anymore. Now get out." And that's how my older brother left the house, where we had grown up together, without a real goodbye, without a hug, without anything. The following weeks were super weird. The house felt empty in a way I hadn't felt even when my mom died, because at least back then we had each other for support. But now, there was this heavy absence of Austin that nobody wanted to mention. Dad never talked about him. Like if I mentioned his name, Dad would just change the subject or get up and go to another room. I broke up with Nicole, obviously. She tried to call me like 1,000 times during those first weeks, but I never answered. Eventually, she gave up, and that was it. Years passed, and I never had contact with Austin again. I finished high school, moved to a nearby city to go to college, studied business administration, and eventually got a job at a real estate agency. During all that time, Austin was like a ghost. I knew he existed somewhere, but I didn't know where or what he was doing with his life. And honestly, I didn't care. Dad never talked about him either, like he had completely erased him from his life, and I followed his example. When I was about 26, almost 27, Dad started feeling sick. At first, it was small things, fatigue, loss of appetite, the kind of things you can ignore or attribute to stress or age, but eventually he got so bad I convinced him to go to the doctor. The results were devastating. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, basically a death sentence. The doctors said maybe he had 6 months, a year if he was lucky. I moved back home to take care of him because there was no way I was going to leave him alone during this. I left my apartment, took a temporary leave from work, and basically dedicated the next year to being with my dad. It was hard, very hard. Watching him deteriorate little by little, this man who had always been so strong and capable, becoming weaker and more dependent. But they were also good times in a way, you know? We spent a lot of time together. We talked about things we had never talked about. He told me stories about my mom that I didn't know. That kind of thing. During all that time, I wondered if I should try to contact Austin to let him know Dad was dying. I had his phone number because my Aunt Sandra had given it to me years before, just in case. But every time I considered calling him, I felt this rage in my chest and decided no, that if Austin really cared about Dad, he would have tried to contact us at some point during the last 9 years. Eventually, I mentioned it to Dad, asked him if he wanted me to try to contact Austin, and he just shook his head and said no, that he had made his decision a long time ago and wasn't going to change his mind now. Dad died at home, in his own bed, on a Monday morning in October. I was there with him, holding his hand, and his last words were telling me he was proud of me and to take care of myself. It was peaceful at the end, I guess, if those things can be peaceful. After he passed, I called the funeral home, called my Aunt Sandra to let her know, started making all the necessary arrangements for the funeral. Aunt Sandra asked me if I had told Austin, and I said no, and she insisted I should, that regardless of what had happened, Austin had the right to know his father had died and to go to the funeral if he wanted. So I finally dialed that number I'd had saved for years. And when Austin answered and heard my voice, he was silent for a second before asking what was wrong. I told him straight, "Dad died this morning. The funeral is Friday at 2 at Thompson Funeral Home. If you want to come, that's the information." And I hung up without waiting for a response. The day of the funeral came, and I was nervous, thinking maybe Austin would show up and there would be some drama or confrontation, but the whole ceremony passed, and he never came. Honestly, I don't know if I felt relieved or disappointed. Maybe both. There were like 40 people there, Dad's friends from work, neighbors, distant family, but no trace of Austin. After the burial, Aunt Sandra told me she had tried to contact him too, to convince him to come, but that he had told her he couldn't, that it was too complicated, whatever that meant. A week after the funeral, I met with Dad's lawyer for the reading of the will. There wasn't much, honestly. Dad wasn't rich, but he had left the house, which was almost paid off, his savings, which were about $50,000, his truck, which was old but still ran well, and some personal things. The will was very clear. Everything to me except $500. He left for Austin with a note that said, "This is more than you deserve, but it's what your mother would have wanted." About 3 weeks after the funeral, I got a text message from Austin. It said, "Hey, I know it's been many years and you probably don't want to talk to me, but we need to talk about Dad and the inheritance. Can we meet somewhere neutral?" I read it like 5 times, not being able to believe that his first contact with me in almost 10 years was to talk about money. I didn't respond immediately. I took 2 days to think about what to do, and finally I responded saying we could meet at a coffee shop near downtown on Saturday morning. Saturday, I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early and ordered a coffee while I waited. Austin arrived on time, at 10 o'clock like we had agreed, and when I saw him walking toward my table, it was super strange, because obviously he had aged. He was like 35 already, but he also looked tired and unkempt in a way I didn't expect. We greeted each other with an awkward hi, and he sat down across from me without ordering anything. He didn't waste time with casual chat or anything, went straight to the point. He told me he had heard from Aunt Sandra about the will and that it didn't seem fair that Dad had left him only $500 after having been his son, for 25 years before what happened. I just looked at him without saying anything at first because I couldn't believe he really expected me to feel sorry for him. I told him Dad had been very clear in his will that he had had years to change his mind if he had wanted to, and that I wasn't going to question his decisions. Austin started arguing that technically the house and money should be split between the two of us as brothers, that what had happened between Nicole and him had been a youthful mistake and shouldn't have ruined his whole life. I interrupted him and told him that a youthful mistake is failing a test or crashing the car, not sleeping with your younger brother's girlfriend in his own bed. And that besides it, wasn't just that act, but the fact that after that he had disappeared completely for 10 years without trying to fix things even once. I told him that when Dad was sick and dying for months he wasn't there, that I was the one who left my life to take care of him, the one who was there in his last moments, the one who organized the funeral that Austin didn't even bother to show up to. Austin said he hadn't gone to the funeral because he knew he wasn't welcome, and it would have been uncomfortable for everyone. And I exploded there. I yelled at him that it wasn't about his comfort but about saying goodbye to his father, that it was the least he could have done. People in the coffee shop started looking at us because I had raised my voice, so I tried to calm down. Austin then changed tactics and got all sentimental, saying he understood I was angry, but that we were brothers and family should stick together. That Dad would have wanted us to support each other. I told him Dad had made very clear what he wanted in his will, and that if he really cared about family, he wouldn't have disappeared for 10 years, wouldn't have missed the chance to reconcile with Dad before he died. I asked him straight if he was there because he really wanted to reconnect with me as a brother, or if he just wanted money, and he was quiet for a moment too long before saying it could be both. I shook my head and told him no, that I wasn't going to give him any of Dad's money, that he had made his choices and now had to live with the consequences, just like I had had to live with the consequences of his betrayal all these years. Austin got angry then and said I was just as stubborn and cruel as Dad, that we were a shit family that never forgave anything, and I told him that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting the consequences, that forgiveness doesn't come with an attached check. He got up from the table saying this wasn't over, that he was going to talk to a lawyer to see if he could contest the will, and I just told him to do whatever he wanted, but it wasn't going to change anything. He left the coffee shop without saying goodbye, and I sat there with my now cold coffee, feeling this mix of rage and sadness. During the following weeks, Aunt Sandra called me several times trying to mediate, telling me Austin was my only brother and that Dad wouldn't have wanted us to end up like this, completely separated. And I tried to explain to her that Dad had been the first to cut the relationship with Austin, that I was just following his example and protecting his wishes. She insisted that 10 years was enough punishment, that people make mistakes and deserve second chances, but I told her it wasn't about punishment, but about natural consequences. That Austin had had all this time to try to fix things and only showed up when there was money involved. I got another message from Austin about a month later, this time asking if I could lend him $10,000 because he was in a difficult financial situation and he would pay me back as soon as he could. I didn't even respond to that message, just left it on read and blocked his number. I don't know if that makes me a bad person or not. Honestly, I'm still not sure. But what I do know is that I didn't owe anything to someone who only looked for me when he needed something. I sold Dad's house about 6 months later because it didn't make sense to keep it when I already had my life in another city, and I used that money plus Dad's savings to make a down payment on a new apartment and reinvest the rest. Aunt Sandra told me. Austin found out about the sale and was furious because I hadn't told him or given him the chance to buy the house, or at least take some memories. But frankly, I didn't care, because he had had months to express interest in anything other than money, and never did. Now, I'm 31, and I live a pretty normal life, work at my real estate agency, dating a girl I met about 8 months ago, have friends, do things on weekends, all normal. Most people don't know. I have a brother because, like I said before, when they ask me, I just say no. It's easier than explaining this whole story. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if things had been different. If Austin had been a better brother, if Dad had been more willing to forgive, if I had been less like Dad in how I handled things. But at the end of the day, I feel I made the right decisions, or at least the decisions I had to make to protect myself and honor my dad's memory. I don't regret having cut Austin out of my life because I think some betrayals are too big to overcome, especially when the person who betrayed you never really tried to fix things until it was economically convenient for them. Family loyalty is important. Dad was right about that, but loyalty has to go both ways, and Austin showed a long time ago that he didn't understand that concept. I don't know what Austin is doing now, where he lives, if he has his own family. None of that. And that's okay. Aunt Sandra occasionally gives me updates I don't ask for, tells me he asks about me sometimes, that he says he wishes he could talk to me, but I know it's not sincere, or at least not the kind of sincerity that matters. If he really wanted to reconnect as a brother, he would have tried before, when there was no inheritance involved, when Dad was still alive, and there was a chance to fix things before it was too late. Sometimes I feel lonely being an effective only child, especially in important moments, or when I need to make big decisions and don't have close family to consult with. But I prefer that loneliness to the alternative of having someone in my life I can't trust. I guess that's the most important lesson I learned from all this, that it's better to be alone than surrounded by people who only look for you when they need you for something.